Welcome back to the NITE Economics YouTube channel, and today we're going to be talking about Gresham's Law and what exactly is it. So this is a little bit different than most of my YouTube videos. Today we're going to kind of just be talking about this like fundamental force, if you will, in economics. This is a natural phenomenon, a natural law, if you will, of economics and essentially of money. So what Gresham's Law is essentially is when you have, let's just say you have two types of money in circulation, right? So let's just use the case of gold and the US dollar. And if you have the option of paying with gold or a dollar, what are you going to choose, right? So let's just say I'm selling this phone, right? I'm selling this phone and I give you, the buyer, the option, hey, you could pay me with either gold or dollars. What are you going to pay me with? You're likely going to pay me with the dollar because you know that gold is going to go up in value into the future. So this is essentially this concept that bad money drives out good money. So if you have two competing currencies, in this case gold and the dollar, the bad money, being the dollar, is going to drive the good money, the gold, out of circulation because everyone's going to start hodling. Everyone's going to start keeping the gold for themselves and use that bad money to buy stuff. And the reason for that is because the gold keeps going up in value. And this is true for Bitcoin. This is why I don't think that Bitcoin could ever have this essentially this property of the value of each Bitcoin going up and up and up in value. This won't stop because of Gresham's Law. This will essentially keep happening into the future. Now that you have that in mind, what Gresham's Law is, I hope you understand what I mean with this and why this is true for Bitcoin as well as gold and stuff, and why they don't work very good as a medium of exchange. In terms of like buying little things, anyways, I guess you could use it for like buying a house or whatever. But in terms of like buying a pizza, it's because of this property here, the Gresham's Law. And I guess there's some people that be like, they'll ignore this. I guess that's also possible too. But generally speaking, it's going to drive the good money out of a circulation, and people are going to start hodling it essentially. Anyways, now that you have that in mind, this podcast is very good. I was listening to this. I haven't finished listening to it actually. So it's the Way Forward podcast. It's actually excellent. They have some very good ideas, and it's kind of like about, kind of taking all matters into your own hands, essentially being responsible for your own health, being responsible for the way you think in many ways, not having to wait for somebody to come save you, like a government to come and save you and solve all your problems. Your problems are you're responsible for your own problems, and you need to essentially solve them yourself, and essentially also creating alternative systems that are outside of the current system, if you will, and start building a community in that, essentially, to have alternatives, So it's some very interesting ideas out there. But anyways, they were talking about Bitcoin, and they talked about this topic about how Bitcoin went in two camps. When it started, I guess once it started getting kind of, they started having this issue with essentially there was too many transactions happening all at the same time because some large companies started using it as a way of payment. And I guess this was before 2010. It must have been like in the 2016 bull run, around that time period, because I wasn't in crypto at that time. So I'm not sure exactly when that happened, but I'm sure it was before 2020 for sure. And essentially they ran into some issues with these large companies wanting to use Bitcoin as a way to make payments, but they ran into this issue because the block size of, so essentially the next block that gets added into the blockchain was, people were competing to get their transactions into it. So essentially the fees were getting out of control, and that's because you have a limit of how big it can be. And essentially there was a fork. I think this is during the fork of the Bitcoin Cash fork. I think that's what happened, right? So there was like, and correct me if I'm wrong about this. I wasn't around during that time, so I wasn't not too sure exactly the time period and what happened. But essentially there was two camps. One camp was thinking of essentially making Bitcoin larger. Sorry, not Bitcoin larger, but the block size larger, so you could fit a much larger amount of transactions into every single block, and I guess as technology moves forward, you could essentially have bigger and bigger blocks. And then there was the other camp that was essentially saying like, no, we're going to do this Bitcoin Cash, which is essentially you take your Bitcoin, you take it off of the ledger, if you will, the official Bitcoin ledger, and then you have this paper Bitcoin that's being transacted like on a second layer. I guess it's a layer 2 solution. And then at the end, once everything's sorted out, then it gets put into the actual Bitcoin blockchain. If I'm explaining that correctly, that's essentially how it worked. And it's essentially kind of like what banks do, where they're essentially lending paper gold, or what they lended paper gold into circulation, but there's only so much on reserve. So it's kind of like a similar concept, right? It might not be exactly that concept, but it's kind of like that essential idea. And it could create some problems, because if you just end up just using the layer 2 solution, how do we know how many Bitcoins actually in reserve, if you will, right? Now I know it's probably more complicated than that, but that's kind of essentially the idea. And yeah, I just thought that was very, very interesting, how the Gresham's law ties into this, because they were talking about how they thought, or how they think that potentially if Bitcoin had gone the route of just increasing the size of the blocks, and it can be increased exponentially into the future, that this issue with Bitcoin value going up into the future will likely still happen, but eventually it would correct itself, so you could actually use Bitcoin as a currency, as a medium of exchange. And I think that particular piece, if you understand Gresham's law, it's impossible. It's impossible to happen unless you're living, and now just humor me for a second. When you live in a world where your basic needs are not met, and another disclaimer I'm going to put out there, I'm not a communist by any stretch of the imagination at all. I don't believe in it. I think it's a horrible system. So just put that out there, right? But let's just assume that you could live in a world where all your basic needs are met, and by that I mean like your food, your shelter, what else? Food, shelter, and let's just say you don't have to pay any bills, right? That's all taken care of, right? I think only in a world like this would a currency like Bitcoin, or like what Bitcoin's initial proposition was, could work in order to eliminate Gresham's law. Gresham's law happens because you live in a world where you don't know what tomorrow holds, right? So I don't think you could get rid of this. And I hope I'm explaining this well, and I'll keep bringing this topic up, and I'll make more videos about this as I gather my ideas and why I think this is the case. So Gresham's law could only be eliminated in a world where everyone's basic needs are taken care of. So you don't need to worry about having to pay the bills, having to buy clothing, having to have shelter, having to eat tomorrow, etc., right? From that standpoint, if those things were taken care of, then yes, something like a Bitcoin could fulfill its original promise of being digital money that is essentially free of corruption, for a lack of a better term. It's fungible. It's so it provides all these like great properties that make gold very, very attractive, minus the fact that it's very difficult to trade with gold, and it's easy to history has told us that they would take gold coins and shed little pieces of it off, and then you would take all the gold gold trimmings that you did and melt it down and make your own gold. So that's how people were like stealing, essentially, or debasing the currency, or mixing it with different types of metals, debasing the gold in that way. So Bitcoin in many ways is free of that, if you will, unless you go in the route of what I think banks are heading towards, where they're essentially becoming custodians of your Bitcoin, and then you could take loans on that Bitcoin, and then you essentially go back in circle to the current system, or at least the system of when gold was being held by goldsmiths or banks at the time, and then they were giving you paper gold to go and spend out into the economy, right? And then you don't know how much gold they have on hand or in their vaults, because then either somebody got the great idea, hey, nobody ever comes and does an audit, I could just hand out as much paper gold as I want, and then start receiving all of these fees for giving out loans and stuff like that, right? So I think something like that, and they mentioned this in this podcast, and I completely agree with what they say. I think that's the way we're headed in terms of what's happening with Bitcoin. I think this proposition of Bitcoin being this thing that's going to change the world in a positive light, I think that boat has sailed for the most part. I still do think it's a fantastic way to make money. That is that I'm not going to argue with at all. But this whole thing where it's like going to change the world and, you know, we're all going to live happily ever after, I don't think so. I still think it does have a lot of very attractive properties to it, but I think the boat has sailed for it being this medium of exchange, this currency, if you will, that's superior to everything else. And and it's a bit unfortunate, although even if it did not fail in that instance, I still think Gresham's law would eventually catch up to it. And I think it's kind of like this quasi good thing, but that also has some very bad things that are happening to it in terms of like the mass adoption that's happening by banks and these big institutions. They're good for the price, but they're not good for freedom. And I guess that's what it boils down to. If you're interested in like full freedom, then the whole banking and all this other stuff, all these big institutions getting into it, you should be completely against it, because it is 100%. It's good for price. It's good for adoption to a large extent as well, of course. But when it comes to people that are fully open-minded to creating alternative systems, is not as good as it used to be. It could still play a role, but it's not what it was. And again, it still would have had some problems that it would have accounted eventually because of Gresham's law. So yeah, that's all I have to say about this particular topic for now. I'll probably bring it up in the future as I kind of solidify my ideas on it and explain it in a more digestible form, if you will. And again, if you're liking the content, subscribe to the channel, drop a like. Let me know if you agree or disagree in the comment section, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care. Bye.